Good afternoon. Welcome. Thanks for joining us for our last Authorizer Connect of this school year. I will mention this again at the end of our session, but I'll be sending out a survey early next week to get your thoughts on this school year's selection of topics and things that you're interested in learning about, talking about, etc. for next school year. And those sessions will start up again in July. So there's no real pause, just moving into a different school year. And so you'll get that survey from me early next week. So today we're talking about what's in a charter agreement, and I have a few guests joining that I'll introduce in a moment. But just want to remind us of our purpose for coming together for these Authorizer Connect meetings. These are opportunities for our authorizers across the state to connect with each other, to share resources, successes, and lessons learned, to do some problem solving, you have professional development, and to continue to build a community with one another. Angie, you can't hear me. Can other people hear me? Can I get a thumbs up if you can hear me? Okay. Someone tell her it's just you. Angie, you might have to restart. All right. And Arlandra, I don't know if you can hear me. Okay, you fixed it, great. Arlandra mentioned the same thing. Seems like everybody else is good though. All right, we'll keep going. So here's our agenda. We're going to do a little bit of a different whip around today because we have some additional people joining, so a bit of a larger group. And then I switched the order of this. We'll do our authorizer spotlight at the end rather than first. So we'll move into the session on the charter agreements. Then we'll do the Achievement School District Spotlight and resources and wrap up as we always do. So here is your whip around. And we're just going to do this in the chat. And while we're doing that, I'm going to introduce a few guests that we have with us today. So in the chat, if you can put your name, your district, your role, put your information in there for everybody to see, and then answer this question for me. What is one, and if you have more than one, tell a teammate. What is one authorizing resource that would be valuable for your team? Just thinking about things we already have in place. It could be an updated version of something or something that doesn't exist at all. But what's one authorizing resource that would be valuable for the team? Pop that in the chat for me. While you're doing that, I want to introduce a few guests that we have. I know there are some board attorneys that opted to join us today, so welcome to you all. Thanks for joining. You're welcome to join at any time, but I think this topic is especially relevant for our board attorneys to tune into. I also want to introduce you all to some new faces from the Department of Education. We have Matt Bowser and Christy Williams. And Matt and Chrissy, if you can each come off of mute and just briefly introduce yourselves, I want to give you a moment to say hi. So Matt, I'll start with you.
Sure, my name is Matthew Bowser. I work with Christy and we support obviously charter schools across the state. This is a newer role for me. I am currently the director of virtual schools, but I'm lending a hand in the charter school space.
Thank you. Christy?
And I'm Christy Williams, and I am new with the department, and I'm also a manager of charter schools, and I'm learning all things charter, and I'm so excited to meet all of you and talk to you. So
thank you. And if you both can just drop your email addresses in the chat, that will be helpful just to share with everybody, but welcome to you both. Those will become familiar faces and wanted to just make sure everyone had a moment to meet you. I also have Angie Sanders, who is the general counsel for the state board. She's waving to you. And then I have Ashley Thomas. She is the general counsel for the Charter Commission, also just waved. And they're going to lead us through our session, so they'll have lots more time to chat with you all, but they are super amazing ladies with lots of knowledge and experience, and they're going to talk with you about charter agreements today. So thank you both for volunteering or being voluntold. I'm not sure which one it was, but thanks for joining joining us today. And then last but certainly not least, I'm going to introduce Michelle Doan. lots of you know Michelle, you've worked with Michelle, we all love Michelle, and Michelle is taking on a new role, and it's something that I've been previewing for you all for a little while, but I'll let Michelle tell you about it. So Michelle, you want to say hello?
Hi, everyone. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces. For those who don't know me, my name is Michelle Doan. I am an education consultant based in Nashville, Tennessee. I've worked with many of you as authorizers with your practices. Also supported a number of charter schools, state departments, and a variety of education organizations. The new role that I am now taking on, some of you received an email from me at the beginning of this week, is that there is the National Network for District Authorizing that is going to be actually coming to Tennessee. So we are trying to get this started in Tennessee. I will be serving as the facilitator for the Tennessee branch and working with Alex Medler, who leads this initiative. He is himself a former authorizer and based in Colorado. So really, I just want to say hello. I will follow up on the email I sent. It had a doodle poll in it. We want to set up an intro call with all of you so we can explain more about the work that NN40A will be doing in Tennessee and the role that we hope to see all of you play in this initiative as well. I'll also be working with Allie kind of along the way, just because I know that she also talks with all of you with these calls and things like that. So we want to make sure we complement the work that she is already doing. But just wanted to say hello, and I am excited to be working with all of you.
Thanks, Michelle. So noticing in the chat, this question is related to that, one of interest for myself, but also for Michelle as she starts to get going, because she'll be helping to build out some of those resources for you all. And I think I've only seen 2 people mention something that they could use. So, I mean, oh my gosh, if we have everything we need, fantastic. But I don't think that's true. I'm seeing some head shaking. So if you can throw in the chat what else you're thinking about, or tell me later, whatever it is. But we want to know what are some resources that you and your authorizing team could use. Continue to populate that in the chat for us. All right, I'm going to move us forward. What is in a charter agreement? Ms. Angie Sanders and Ms. Ashley Thomas are going to lead us through, and I will move the slides forward for you all. Angie, you're starting us off. Go for it.
Okay, well, it is good to see some familiar faces and see some names too that I don't recognize. And Ashley and I are excited to talk to you all today about what is in a charter agreement. Again, I'm Angie Sanders. I'm the general counsel for the State Board of Education. And then we also have Ashley Thomas, who's the general counsel for the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission. We're going to kind of tag team this, and I apologize if I have to scoot out a little bit early. I have a conflicting appointment that might butt up right at the end of this presentation, so Allie knows and can fill in any gaps if I do have to scoot out right at the end. But quick disclaimer, obviously we are not your attorneys, and so, well, unless you work for the State Board or the Charter School Commission. Therefore, this is just information and not legal advice. Always consult your board attorney. And, you know, I have to disclaim my disclaimer because I also don't have the rights to this image. So just know that, take it with a grain of salt. All right, next slide, please. Okay, the charter agreement. So obviously, you all know this is the formal legal document that governs the operation of the charter school and the relationship between the school and the authorizer. So while the application is a detailed explanation of how the sponsor plans to operate the school, the agreement is essential in setting forth the requirements for the relationship between the charter school and the authorizer. So who is responsible for what? What is the charter school going to be held accountable for? What is the authorizer going to be held accountable for? It's really a supplement, essentially, to the charter school application that governs that relationship. State law and the State Board of Education's quality authorizing standards outline a lot of the basic necessary requirements for the agreement. And so what I'm going to do in the first half of this presentation is walk through what does state law and the quality authorizing standards say about some of the basic requirements of an agreement. And then Ashley will walk through how the Charter Commission has put that into practice. All right, next slide. All right, so starting out with state law, there is obviously Title 49, Chapter 13, which governs everything really relating to charter schools in Tennessee. And Section 110 outlines some of the basic requirements for charter agreements. It says that you have to have one and that it has to be signed by the sponsor and the authorizer. And when the sponsor signs it, it is then binding upon the governing body if those two are different in the very beginning. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. This is, I just want to reiterate, a separate document from the application and is required by law to contain all of the material components of the application. And we'll talk in just a minute a little bit more about that. But most charter agreements reference the application and say something like it is incorporated by reference or attach it as an exhibit to the agreement, just to make sure that it's clear that those two work together. The law states that it is a 10-year term and provides things like the governing body can petition to amend the agreement, and that goes through the Charter Commission's rules. If the LEA changes grade bands for its schools, then the law states that they have to notify each charter school at least 120 days in advance. You would likely want to include that requirement in your agreement. It also states that upon termination of the agreement, any public funds, property, etc., that the school purchased with public funds revert back to the LEA. So making that really clear in your agreement is going to be important. And also says that what happens if a charter school closes, that the charter school is responsible for all debts, and you would want to make sure that that's clear as well. Also, I just want to make it clear that this is just one section of Chapter 13. There are a lot of other legal requirements peppered throughout Chapter 13. So for those attorneys on the call, making sure that you're looking at any other sections for what you might want to include. Okay, so moving on to the quality charter authorizing standards. Standard 3 covers the requirements for charter agreements, and specifically starting with Standard 3A, that standard addresses agreement negotiation and execution. And we'll talk about this a little bit at the end of the presentation when we get into common issues that we see. And I feel like a lot of them are centered around this standard. So I think it's important to pay attention to this, and we're covering it at just a really high level, but there is additional guidance that Allie can link for you all in the chat or send out that goes into a little bit more detail about specifically what we're looking for in each substandard. But just to give you an idea, the big things are executing a charter agreement between the authorizer and the governing body, and then ensuring mutual understanding and acceptance of the terms of the charter agreement by the school's governing board. Next slide. So again, still staying with Standard 3, but turning to 3B, which deals with the terms, rights, and responsibilities. All three of these things need to be clearly outlined in the agreement. So the first is obviously that 10-year charter term that we talked about. And then also the requirement for a high stakes review every 5 years and the requirement for annual performance reports. So making sure that those three big checkpoints are outlined in your agreement. Explicitly defining the material terms of the charter agreement and allowing and requiring amendments for occasional material changes to the school's plan, but not requiring those for non-material changes. And so what is the difference between material and non-material changes? The Charter Commission's rule that deals with charter amendment appeals goes into some good detail about what they consider to be a material modification. It is not an exhaustive list though, but just to give you an idea of some of the things that are mentioned in their rules, that includes changes in governance structure, the addition or removal of grades, student enrollment changes that exceed the threshold that's identified in the agreement, or changes to location if it's outside of the geographic area that you've approved in their application. So just being really clear in the agreement, what is considered a material term that is going to then trigger if they want to change that, they know they have to submit an amendment request to the authorizer. Next slide. So I'm not going to read through everything in 3B because 3B is quite long, but just to highlight a few additional ones, the agreement must respect the school's autonomy over things like educational programs, staffing, and scheduling. So when you're drafting the charter agreement, being really sensitive to what things are within the purview and authority of the charter school, and then what is the role of the authorizer, which is more oversight, ensuring that they're complying with the requirements of law or the agreement, but not getting into the nitty gritty like daily operation of the school. Clearly defining performance standards and criteria for renewal, intervention, etc. Outlining statutory and regulatory requirements for the school's operation. So that some big things that come to mind there, obviously, like compliance with IDEA or Section 504. So being really clear, like here are, you have to comply with IDEA. Here's how that works. Here's what the authorizer is going to do with regard to compliance. Here's what you're required to do, those sorts of things. All right. Well, I'm going to hand it over to Ashley to talk a little bit more about this, and then we'll talk about common pitfalls.
Thanks, Angie. So as she stated, first let me start. Ashley Thomas, General Counsel for the Commission. But as Angie stated, there's a lot of background, and so I just want to go through what these considerations look like in practice for the Commission. As the authorizer, we tend to give the first draft of the charter agreement and related exhibits to our operators post-application approval. As Angie mentioned, 49-13-107 does set forth application requirements. And so we use that as a basis to draft our charter agreements, and we try to draft up to those standards that Angie just mentioned. So I'm going to go over just a couple of examples from our agreements, and I've included the language here, but the full agreements are available on our website. Our first example would be subpart 7 of TCA 49-13-107, which requires that proposed rules and policies for governance and operation of the school be included. And that's reflected in our section 1.1. That's where we lay out the controlling laws and policies that we expect the schools to comply with while they're under our portfolio. You can go to the next slide, Allie. Subpart 9 of state law also requires that a charter application include a description of any anticipated enrollment as well as non-discriminatory admissions. We codify that in section 2.1 of our charter agreements. You'll see here that we include the non-discriminatory language, and then we include just a maximum enrollment amount in our agreements. We name a specific fluctuation range that our operators would have to report to us to determine if it's a material change that would trigger an amendment. And I will say I've found that our operators have expressed an appreciation for the autonomy of having that range versus a set number triggering an amendment. This particular language I found allows our authorizing team to sort of work year over year with our operators to ensure that natural fluctuation that happens in enrollment does not cause significant harm to the operation, and it becomes really clear when an amendment is required. We can go to the next slide. Another example would be subpart 20 of state law that includes a transportation plan if a school is deciding to offer that service, and that's included in our section 6 of our agreements. Again, this service is not necessarily required for charter schools, but we do include language in our agreements that really speak to the flow of funds, just to avoid any confusion should the school decide to offer that service. This language kind of shows that the bigger consideration for our schools is whether or not the school provides that transportation. And I'm pointing that out to differentiate if they decide to have a transportation plan, that would trigger an amendment, but a modification to that plan would not. And I've mentioned it a couple of times as far as amendments are concerned, but we want to try to think about, we can go to the next slide, Allie, I'm sorry. Yeah, we want to make sure that the agreements, as Angie mentioned, reflect the autonomy for our operators, but we want to clearly define what requires an amendment, as we stated in standard 3B. a quality authorizer should allow for changes to the school's plans, but only require a formal amendment for material changes. And I'm including an example here from our charter agreement. It's section 1.4. It deals with our performance frameworks. This section states that we as authorizers would provide advance notice to charter schools of any changes in state or federal accountability. That will not require an amendment because that is binding on all charter schools. But you can see here, we also include language that if the commission proposes changes to the framework that's not predicated by a legislative update or by accountability updates, those changes are not binding until we amend the agreement and obtain signature from the operator. This is just an example to show that responsibilities are evident in the agreement on both sides for the operators as well as the authorizer. We can go to the next slide. For our agreements, we also include language about renewal of charter agreements. I know Angie mentioned that earlier as far as the high stakes review at 5 years and then renewal at the end of the 10-year term. For commission agreements, that's found in section 11.1. I did not include that here, but I'll just speak to it briefly. That particular section details what the renewal process will look like, but we include references to renewal throughout the charter agreement just to sort of flag for the operators what is potentially up for renegotiation when we get to the renewal period. On the whole, there are two ways that authorizers could codify a renewed agreement. You could first draft an entirely new agreement, or you could renew your existing charter agreement for a new 10-year term. And then you would make any amendments, an attachment or an exhibit to that extended agreement. Again, if you choose to renew your original agreement, I think my flag here would be just to make sure that you obtain signatures on that amendment and that it clearly states the changes or amendments to that agreement, and it clearly defines the roles and responsibilities of all the parties. We can go to the next slide. I will say in practice for the commission, we just completed our first renewal cycle, and our approach is to draft an entirely new agreement. If the renewal application is approved by the commission, we then begin negotiations on a brand new charter agreement pretty immediately. Our goal is to have the terms negotiated and the charter agreement in a final form ready for the commission's deliberation and consideration at our next quarterly meeting following that initial approval. And that negotiation also includes negotiating the exhibits that would be attached to that agreement. And for us, that would be the application, the waivers that the school used throughout the charter term or that need to be updated, as well as the performance framework that they'll be held accountable to. For the commission, that previous agreement would then become an exhibit, to the renewed charter agreement. And so either approach works, but like I said, you just want to make sure that the roles are clearly defined and you have those signatures, as Angie mentioned, from standard 3. We can go to the next slide. So now I just want to give you just some best practices that I've found that have helped me at the commission. I will say, once again, at the commission, we tend to provide the first draft. It helps for me to sort of draft up to the quality authorizing standards so we can use that as a basis. But I would say my first piece of advice would be to start negotiations shortly after approval, and you want to communicate early and often. For the commission, we tend to begin deliberating and negotiating terms well before the commission makes a decision. I am clear with the parties that any conversation that I have, any questions that I'm answering is not an indication of how the application will be voted on by the commission, but we do want to sort of level set and set expectations in the event the application is approved. I will say at the commission, we've sort of developed a welcome packet that sort of includes a draft of that charter agreement and those related exhibits so that the operators are aware of all the pieces that will be moving post-approval if the commission decides in that way. And then as far as a cadence for that communication, I would say we probably communicate on a bi-weekly basis. That's inclusive of emails and phone calls just to sort of talk through any expectations or answer any questions as we're working through the charter negotiation. When you're thinking about the charter agreement terms themselves, I would definitely say you want to include key members of your team in drafting those terms. I'll give a shout out to my commission colleagues. I go to them early and often with particular terms of the charter agreement, just relying on their expertise and knowledge, lessons learned from previous cycles, any pitfalls we need to look for in the specific terms. And so I really depend on them for those items. And so I definitely appreciate them throughout that. And I would encourage you all to do the same. You want to set deadlines for your drafts. As we know, charter agreements are a huge lift. And when you are in the daily work of operator and authorizer, it can sort of be lost in the shuffle because it's a lot of paperwork, but you want to make sure that you set those deadlines. And so what I found that helps me is I'll send a first draft and I'll include an initial deadline for track changes to be sent back to me. At the commission, we do use a file sharing platform so that all parties are working from the same version as we're going through negotiation. But that does not mean that emails do not work because, as we know, systems can fail. So whatever your legal team decides, that will be fine. But you want to set those deadlines and make sure that everybody is working from the same version. Additionally, those deadlines will sort of flag for you if you need to have larger conversations or more communication touch points. And then finally, my last piece of advice would be to remember to include any exhibits or attachments with that agreement during the negotiation process. Specifically for the commission, we try to make sure that waivers are top of mind for our operators. Again, this will bubble up anything that can be a sticking point for our schools. It also illuminates any item that may need to be a term of a charter agreement versus just living the exhibit. At the commission, we tend to look at our exhibits as more of a living document that we can sort of go back to throughout the term of the charter, so that we can have those small incremental changes without needing to trigger an amendment for the operation of the charter school. And that, like I said, with that frequent communication, it will bubble up what needs to be a term that you don't think you'll probably go back to that often, but something versus something that would come up maybe year over year that you want to put in an exhibit that you can kind of look at without needing commission or board approval. Again, I'll just reiterate that I think communication is probably your biggest aid in negotiating a charter agreement. I think all of the things that I've sort of outlined will become obvious with that constant communication, and it will help establish a strong foundation with that charter agreement. And like I said, just communicate, overly communicate, actually. So I guess I will turn it back to Angie to sort of go over any evaluation feedback.
Before we do that, I want to pause here because you just shared a lot of really great information. And I know I had questions at the end, but I think it's a good opportunity to pause. So thank you for that, Ashley. And to everyone, I did share, of course, we have the link in the slide deck to all of the commission's charter agreements. They are on their website. So you can pull them up and you'll find very similar bits of information across all of the agreements. And then there was also in the email last week with this slide deck, a copy of one of theirs that you can refer to. But Ashley, before I open it up to additional questions, and Rachel, I see you, I'll come to you next, two from me. So one, can you talk about just the timeline that you all are looking at when you're speaking to a negotiation process? Give us a sense of what is that timeline.
Sure. So for example, if we're going through a new start appeal, as you know, that starts in the summer for us, but we get closer to, let's say, September or October, we're sort of looking at what the recommendations are. But like I said, first I start with, this does not mean you're being approved. And we sort of just talk through, we guide them to the website, tell them take a look at the charter agreements that are already approved so they get a preview of what the commission's expectations are. Our commission decides early October. I would say probably that next week we are making first contact with any approved schools and sending them just a draft charter agreement, almost template. And I ask them within the first 2 or 3 weeks to send me back any track changes, and we do that through Microsoft Teams. And then, like I said, probably bi-weekly, I'm checking in and determining if we can talk via email, if we need to set up a phone call, if I need to pull in additional teammates. And so from October, we're looking to have that agreement approved at our January meeting. So between October and January is when we're negotiating those agreements and exhibits.
Great, thank you. And then one other question, in terms of legislative changes, you named a few moments in the examples of where you have some specific language that speaks to that. But we all know changes happen often. And so how do you all handle the regular updates that potentially could be needed versus setting your charter agreements up to kind of weather those changes? What does that look like?
Yeah, so for us, looking at legislative changes, we really, as far as it relates to the charter agreements, if it is something so significant that it sort of touches multiple areas of their operation, if it significantly changes how they have to operate, right? We then have to go back and negotiate with them what that looks like and talk about each term that will need to be changed. If it's something that we can address in one of our exhibits, whether it's one of our checklists, if it's our waivers, if it's something like that, that's not something that needs commission approval. But shortly after, let's say, session closes, we go through all of those legislative changes and then we look at our charter agreements. I will say at the commission, we look at our charter agreements annually just to determine if there's any significant change that sort of invalidates any part of that agreement. And if that is the case, then we sort of have to go back to the drawing board with our operators and renegotiate those terms.
Thank you. Rachel.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, thanks. Well, thank you for this presentation. It's very helpful. I was just wondering about that first bullet point, and this is something I've always kind of wondered about because I don't have the exact statute in front of me, but I think it's somewhere in chapter 13, and I think there's also an AG opinion that kind of talks about how the authorizer can't require negotiations after the board has voted to approve. So I don't know if you have any feedback for us on, you know, how much negotiation can be done after the approval versus before, or if that's, you know, I know you asked for suggestions for future resources, but that could be, I think, really helpful if you have any feedback.
So I will say at the commission, I would say I treat each charter agreement as a brand new separate agreement. For the most part, unless it is mandated by statute, I'd say any term is negotiable. And that's why I say the frequent communication is necessary for us, because we start at the very top of the agreement and walk all the way down to the signature block and discuss that after approval. Like I said, unless it is required by law, we are open to communication and negotiation for charter terms.
Okay, and that's even after there's been a vote to kind of approve.
Right. So the approval
The
for
charter
us,
agreement.
again, because we're an appellate authorizer, I think we're probably in a little bit of a different situation.
Okay.
The approval, of course, is on that application, but the charter agreement is being negotiated after that approval, and then at a different commission meeting.
Okay. Thank you.
One other thing to add to that, because that's a good question, Rachel, and I know what AG opinion you're talking about. And one word of caution, I think there are a couple of old AG opinions out there that were issued prior to the charter school law being significantly updated. And I think 2019, around the time that the Charter School Commission was created.
Mhm.
I think at that point, the law was made a lot more clear that there is a requirement for a separate charter agreement to be created. There's an old AG opinion out there that talks about a school being able to operate just on their charter agreement. I don't agree that under the way the law is now structured is something that would still hold water.
Okay.
So I think just being mindful of the fact that the law has changed significantly since a lot of those AG opinions came out. And I think the real intention there was to make sure that authorizers knew that, like, well, you couldn't just hold up the process indefinitely by being unreasonable during contract negotiation and say, well, we could never agree, so this school can never open. The negotiations need to be done in good faith. And I think that's the point of the authorizing standards, to say that there has to be mutual understanding and acceptance of the agreement. And there's, I think a goal of it being done within 6 months of approval. So understanding that it needs to be happening on a rather quick timeline so that you're not holding up the opening of the school.
Okay, that makes sense. And I appreciate both of your feedback, so thank you.
Other questions that anyone wants to ask now? Okay, I will move us forward. Angie, back to you.
Sure. Okay, so I hopefully will be able to get through all of this before I have to run, but Allie and I are just going to cover briefly some of the common feedback issues, I guess, that we see during charter school authorizer evaluations. So the first one is unclear effective dates and/or the agreements are signed years after the school opened or was approved. And so those are sort of two separate things, but being very clear in your agreement, like when is the effective date of the agreement, whether that's from the date that it's signed by both or that it's effective on a very specific date. It's sometimes hard to tell based on language that we've seen in the past. And then again, we've run into issues where an agreement was signed maybe by the school in 1 year and the authorizer like multiple years later. And I think that probably was a result of the LEA realizing that no one actually signed the agreement, even though it was approved by the board. So just making sure that you're crossing T's and dotting I's around those agreements, because you will then have to submit them as part of your authorizer evaluation if that school is selected. The agreement is not signed by the required parties, which are the sponsor and the authorizer. So again, the law is very clear about who needs to sign it. If the sponsor and the governing body are the same, then it would just be the chair of the governing body. I don't know how often we really see the sponsor being sort of separate and then transitioning over to a governing body. But then also the school board chair. And so being really careful about when you see, sometimes we'll see like the executive director of the CMO signing the agreement, and feedback we've had for LEAs in that situation is, well, did you get some sort of documentation from the governing body that they, number one, approved the agreement, and number two, authorized the executive director to sign on their behalf? So we want to see a clear through line that that executive director was actually authorized to sign it and bind the board. Because in that case, if they just sign it, they may not have had authority to bind the governing body. And then also same thing with the school board. If the school board approved it and it's not signed by the chair of the governing body, but it's instead signed by the director of charter schools or the director of schools, we want to see some clear authorization for who is signing on the board's behalf there. Exhibits referenced in the agreement not being attached to the agreement or they're mislabeled. This is something we see a lot, and I think LEAs lose really unnecessary points on their authorizer evaluations for this because it's such a simple thing, but they have all these exhibits and say the charter agreement's exhibit 1, the performance agreement's exhibit 2, but then none of the exhibits are attached. Or it says it's exhibit 1, 2, and 3, but then we have exhibits like ABC or the numbering is off. It just sort of runs the gamut, but making sure that you're really clear when it comes to your exhibits. And then also, I think as Ashley mentioned, when you, depending on how you do a renewal agreement, or if you're amending the agreement in any way, being really clear about exhibits as part of those amendments or renewals. Not clearly stating the material terms of the agreement. We've talked about this a lot already, but being really clear about what is considered a material term that's then going to potentially trigger a request for an amendment. The next slide. And Allie, feel free to jump in on any of this if you need to. Not providing the school with opportunity or enough time to review the agreement, negotiate, and ask questions. This kind of goes back to Rachel's question and a lot of what Ashley talked about, but really showing that you understand that not only, it's not just like, hey, sign this. it is a mutual negotiation process. You want to make sure that the school understands what they're signing and that they have enough time to review it, discuss it with their attorney, ask questions, all of that sort of thing. Including terms in the agreement that are not authorized in the law or that infringe on charter school autonomy. So we see this every now and then. An example of this is reasons for revocation. So the law is very, very clear about the reasons that a charter school can be revoked by its authorizer, or charter school agreement can be revoked by the authorizer. And sometimes we'll see that the authorizers attempted to add additional revocation grounds into the agreement that are outside of what the law allows. And so just being really careful about that. And then another example that we've seen that sort of deals with infringing on charter school autonomy is requiring authorizer approval for certain purchases. And then the last one that's listed here is unclear renewal standards. So again, just being really clear about what are you requiring from your schools for renewal? What are you going to be sending them? What standards are you holding them to? So that they really understand what to expect going into renewal. And then of course, making sure that your policies are shored up. If you've got a really strong policy, being able to reference that also helps a lot. Allie, anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah, a couple of things to add on the renewal standards. This is one that we've talked about in previous sessions, and is something that I consistently hear from charter school leaders as a question mark. So as part of evaluations, you all know we interview your school leaders. And this is a question that we specifically ask. What are the renewal standards? How do you know if you're going to be renewed? And they cannot answer that question. And so even if it is in your charter agreement, which is where it is required to be at a minimum, having some type of policy or document that further explains and is actively and regularly communicated, especially if the school is about to get ready for renewal, is really, really important. They should have a very clear understanding of their standing and how your board is going to make a decision on their renewal before they even submit their renewal application. Another thing I wanted to note just on the previous one, a lot of you have charter agreements that were put in place long before you joined the team. And so some of this is you're having to go back and kind of unravel some of the things that were in place before you. Thanks, Angie. And so I think the point in highlighting some of this is not only to set you up in terms of new agreements that you're working on, but to identify things that we regularly see in evaluations to look out for as you're going back through past agreements that are currently in place to flag. Those are things that these examples have come out of. They're not new agreements. They're agreements that have been in place for a while and say things that are not allowable. And so that is why we wanted to highlight some of this, because many of you are in positions where you really should be looking back at agreements that are already active to make sure that they are hitting or meeting our quality standards and providing authorizers with the autonomy that they deserve. So that's the end of our list here. And I know Angie just had to pop off, but any questions about the standards, evaluations, charter agreements on the whole? What can we answer? Go ahead, Rachel.
Oops, sorry. Sorry that I'm full of questions today, but
Please go ahead.
if no one else has any, I'll chime in. So one thing I've always wondered about, which I might as well ask, well, there are so many experts here, is this provision in 4913-111 that says that the charter schools have to meet the performance standards and requirements adopted by the State Board of Education for public schools. And, you know, that is often kind of quoted in charter agreements, but I've never been able to find out exactly, what performance standards that's referring to. So does that mean that charter schools have to follow all of the same state board rules that any other public school would have to follow? Is there a definition of performance standards somewhere that I've just not been able to locate?
I don't know, Ashley, if you want to try to tackle that first.
So I would just say at the commission, we do lean on state board as far as the performance standards and requirements. But Ally, I don't know if you have additional thoughts there.
So Rachel, it's my understanding, and I will confirm this with Angie, but this is referring to those accountability measures. So
Okay.
your hunch about them being similar to other schools, absolutely. Because certainly the authorizer has the authority to create your own additional, performance frameworks that really outline all the specifics. But it's my understanding that that is referring to the broader accountability standards that the state
Okay.
board sets.
Okay, so it's just, you think, I know you're gonna check with Angie, limited to accountability though, and it's not just like a general reference to all like state board requirements for public schools.
So there certainly are. I know there is another point in law where, or is regularly quoted in charter agreements that says you are required to follow all state board rules and policies, but that's not specific for the phrase performance standard. So that's
Okay.
why I'm kind of separating those as two different ideas.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Other questions? Okay. Well, thank you again, Ashley and Angie, though she's not here at the moment. Really appreciate the insight. If you have additional questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or reach out to myself and I can forward that on to Ashley and Angie, or reach out to them directly. Either way, we're all here to help as best as we can. So I'll wrap us up for that portion and turn it over to Adrian. We are ahead of schedule, which is great. So lots of time for your team, Adrian, but you are our final spotlight for the year. So take it away.
Thanks so much, Ally. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. The purpose of today's meeting is for us to talk specifically about the annual site visit process that the ASD engages in each year. We're going to talk specifically about some of our processes for site visit documentation. We'll talk a little bit about the various interviews that we conduct with stakeholders, our scheduling kind of process and what that structure looks like. And then we, most importantly, want to have an opportunity to hear from you as far as just best practices that you want to share with the rest of the group regarding things that you feel have just really been helpful for you and your teams throughout the years as you've engaged in this annual site visit process. So as you all know, the annual site visits essentially give authorizers this opportunity to evaluate every aspect of the charter school's operations. So this is, inclusive of a variety of stakeholder interviews, a deep dive into not only the quantitative data that we see day in and day out with performance data, but also getting a lot of great qualitative data as you're having these discussions with various stakeholders. And so throughout the site visit process, we conduct a series, like I mentioned, of interviews with stakeholders to get kind of like a holistic kind of perspective on how the school is performing, but then we also are on site observing classroom instruction. We are conducting audits, so we'll do anything from inventory audits to safety inspections for the duration of the visit. And so essentially, once we've collected all of this data as a team, we connect and then we develop a written report that is then shared with the school's leadership team and their governing board. And the purpose of this report is to really help continuous improvement planning as they look ahead to the next school year. Okay. So again, the overall purpose of the annual site visit, it really kind of boils down to these four things. One, it helps us to identify the areas of strength and areas of need for follow-up and continued support for all of our operators. Again, it is aligned to us ensuring that we are in compliance with our obligations as an authorizer to monitor charter contract compliance. We're also collecting information, again, which cannot be obtained otherwise in accordance with the contract. And also it's helpful as we're supporting our operators and then their hopefully respective receiving LEAs with information that will support renewal decisions. And lastly, this also helps us to gain a deeper understanding of the overall school program through open discussion with stakeholder groups. Okay, so site visit documentation. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just a random sample of some of the pieces of documentation and artifacts that we request from our operators in preparation for the site visit. As you can see, these are, arranged with the programmatic pieces in mind as well as operational components. And so we have a timeline essentially that we provide our operators with for submission of these documents well in advance of the visit so that our team has an opportunity to take a deep dive. And then we can, ask specific questions of the network and school team regarding this documentation during the site visit and the interview process. So the next few slides, I'm not going to read these verbatim, but these are slides that I've included that are a part of our individualized school leader prep sessions that we have. And so although we convene all of our operators together for one joint session where we talk about the purpose of the site visit, we talk about the alignment to the quality authorizing standards, we talk about the alignment to their charter contract. That just gives them kind of like this big high level overview. After that, we then have an opportunity to have essentially one-on-one sessions with the school teams to really take a deep dive into all the different areas that we'll be observing throughout the duration of the site visit. And so these slides provide you with just a little bit of that kind of detail regarding what the actions will be for the ASD team, as well as what the school team is going to be required to do. So Allie, you can actually advance through. So you all can see that there's several different topics and focus areas here, ranging from human resources to 504 documentation, review of their cumulative records and what that storage process looks like. Of course, inventory management, wanting to make sure that we've got both federal and state grants that are identified within these inventory logs and that they have the appropriate asset tags. And this school culture slide here, again, this is just kind of a deep dive for the operators to just let them know that these are going to be the required pieces of documentation that we're requesting. On the day of the visit, you know, we would like to have printed copies of these so that we can review and discuss as a team. And then, of course, you know, we've got listed there below in the green box some of the actions that our expectations for the school team. So all of our site visit documentation is uploaded to our SharePoint. So we have it organized by kind of departments. You've got HR and personnel, operations, school culture. There's a site visit logistics page or folder, and this is essentially where all of the school maps, the master schedule, bell schedule, and the finalized site visit schedule live. And then, of course, lastly, you've got the special populations. And so there are different required documents that have to be uploaded within those folders prior to the actual date of the visit. So this next slide, this gives you an overview of all of the different documents that we request to be uploaded prior to the visit. And so you can see here, you've got each of the different artifact categories listed out over on the left. And then we wanted to be really intentional about being transparent with operators to let them know exactly what we were looking for in regards to each piece of documentation. So at this point, I want to stop because I know that was a lot of talking for me and I want to hear from you. And so I'm sorry about that. I am down to one monitor right now. There was a storm that came through, so I had to turn my camera off so I could see the screen here. But you've got two questions here on the screen. So this first one, I believe, is just how do you organize your annual site visit documentation and deliverables? And then the second one is, what challenges have you faced this year while conducting site visits, and what adjustments did you make? So those are kind of our two discussion questions that we have right now at this point in the presentation, and I'll just kind of open it up for anyone to share.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Awesome. I was having issues earlier. Arlandra Parker from Memphis Shelby County Schools. And my colleague Kwachi Spencer, Director of Organizational Quality, does the annual site visits as far as organizing for all of our 53 schools. But a challenge that I can speak of on behalf of our office is that us receiving data this year was a challenge because much of our annual site visits are data driven. And so just having the schools to be able to speak to their data and then what they're going to do to address certain deficit areas. And so that was a challenge for us. As far as organization with our documents, we do a similar thing as far as organizing, having a report that's provided to schools after the site visit has concluded. Us identifying noticings and wonderings during that particular visit, and then providing some type of feedback that the schools definitely within the realm of their autonomy can, utilize to move forward. So that's just a slight overview of something that we do with our annual site visits.
Thank you so much for sharing.
No problem.
Arlandra, can you say a little bit more about the data challenge that you had? Are you referring to the state data
Yes.
or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, definitely referring to the state data. Because we conduct our annual site visits starting late September early November. And so with us having such a large portfolio, it takes us a couple months to get all of our annual site visits done. And so this year, as we know, the data wasn't released from the state, as early as we have had historically. And so that was just a slight challenge. We persevered and we were able to move through, but that was just something that sort of put a little.
What did you all use instead?
So we utilized the most available data that we had, and the schools were able to share like their benchmark data, universal screener, those types of things in order to be able to speak to some trends and to speak to the work that needs to be done for that particular school year. And of course, we break it up for academics, operations, and finance. So of course, we had our operations and finance data. It was just the academic piece that was a lag for us. And so we just tried to use the in-house things that we had to support that.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Thank you for that that call out, Arlandra. For our performance presentations, we utilize the school's most recent benchmarks as well, and their screener data, and then also culture and behavior data to look at their discipline trends for suspensions and expulsions.
Adrian, I would like to say though that while you were presenting, my team members are on a different meeting right now. And so I was texting them telling me that there were some good things that you were sharing. And so that we're going to be going back and just looking at it and just working through some things that maybe that we can implement in ours moving forward. So thank you for that.
Wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Teresa Nixon, Knox County Schools. And for me, and I think many of you on here know that it was, this is year one for me. And so, Adrian, thank you for sharing what you all are doing, because this has been a year of me like stepping back and having the opportunity to see what all of you all are doing across the state and really rethinking our practice. I know part of our original practices was 2 site visits a year, which was super easy when we had the one school. We're adding a second school, and as I continue to say, what might it look like if we had more than the 1 or 2 schools? So it is so nice that many of you have been on this journey and are so willing to share. And I just wanted to echo my thanks in sharing such great thinking, because that is one of my tasks over the summer, is to rework this. And so a lot of what you shared will be a framework for us as we're really rethinking this. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Excellent. And my partner in crime, Jessica, she's on the call as well. And so she is a wealth of knowledge and can also support as well, as we collaborate across, our fabulous team of authorizers to just align. Because you're right, Teresa. I think there's an opportunity for us to be as like consistent as possible with our site visit kind of implementation and just even the structure, because we wanted to really set the bar and the expectation for, regardless of what authorizer you're under, you're still going to be held to those same expectations. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, well, I think we can go ahead and proceed to the next slide. All right, so interviews and scheduling. We conduct a lot of interviews. And so if you would like some of the interview questions that we ask the different department leads or stakeholders, please, feel free to reach out, or Allie, I can send those to you and you can share them with the group. But we conduct a variety of interviews just to, again, collect as much data and information as possible on just, the viability of the organization, and just to really see if there's some alignment and some trends with, are the network staff members saying the same things that the school leaders are saying? And are the governing board members in alignment with the school teams? And so a lot of it gives us an opportunity to see if there's some consistency of messaging, as well as if there's alignment across not only the school, but the entire network, as we're thinking about it holistically. This next slide, this is one that we use with school leaders. And so again, just pointing out school leader actions and ASD team actions. So for the school leader, we ask that they upload the contact information for their governing board members to the SharePoint folder. And we give them a certain date or deadline to do that. And then we also request that contact information for 5 parents and families are uploaded as well so that we can conduct those interviews. And then one thing to note here for ASD, I'm really intentional about making sure that a finalized site visit schedule is provided to the team within 1 week of the site visit. And this is just a snapshot or sample of one of the visits that we had just recently with our operator, Journey Community Schools, their school, Journey Coleman. It looks like a lot, and I'll just preface this by saying this is a K-8 school. And so the schedules for the K-5 or the 6-8 schools or high schools, it's not as extensive. For those schools, we were able to really wrap up the day around 2 o'clock. But because there were so many, we really wanted to get a representative sample as far as classroom observations and visits, and really making sure that we're able to see as much as we could during that visit. And again, I do want to also say that we have reoccurring visits throughout the year. So we're on campus and we're seeing what's happening at the school. But for the purpose of the site visit, this is the only time when our entire team is on site together. So it's really important for us to be able to connect and talk about what we're seeing, in the building, because it really, of course, gives us different perspectives and different viewpoints. So we try to capture as much as we can. And then this slide, I think this was to Arlandra's point. We don't have as many schools in our portfolio as you all do, but we still have to kind of stagger our site visit schedule. So we ended up landing on 2 cohorts. So we did cohort 1. Those visits were held in January and February, and we were intentional about cohort 1. Those visits were for schools that are transitioning out of ASD. And then cohort 2, those schools remaining those were held later in the spring. And that also gives us an opportunity to just kind of like have a little bit of a break as in between developing reports and kind of funneling those through, because again, all of the other day-to-day tasks are still in front of us. And as far as the site visit documentation goes, we grappled with a lot of different ideas, and we really landed on having a Microsoft form where we can capture interview responses, record classroom observations. We would document audit findings. So we would have a specific checklist for things that we're looking for the inventory audit, the safety inspection, when we're looking at HR records and cumulative records. So we have checklists that are embedded within the Microsoft form. And then there's also an opportunity for us to capture any pictures because when we're interviewing our K2 students, it's always helpful if we ask them to draw a picture of, you know, what they like the most about school, or what's most enjoyable about their school experience. And some of them would like to draw a picture to kind of illustrate that. And so we have an opportunity to capture any of those photos, and then other important pieces of documentation as well within the Microsoft form. Okay, so now, again, time to stop and discuss. That actually kind of wraps up the entire presentation, but I wanted to have the bulk of the time. It looks like we've got, what, about 10 minutes? I have about 10 minutes, Alex. Okay. So there's 4 questions here. And I know a couple of you already alluded to this first one. What scheduling cadence do you use for your annual site visits? How do you capture the data during the actual visit? What are some takeaways that you have from today's session? And then also, what best practices do you want to just share with the rest of the group? So all of those questions are just up for discussion, and would love to hear from you all.
Adrian, just want to flag that Teresa popped a question in the chat. She asked how many people are on each of your site visit teams?
Oh, great question. So we have 3 people per team. So we have 3 team members per site visit team. And the way that our teams are organized, typically team 1 is focused on the HR records, the cumulative folders. Of course, there's classroom observations, but team 1 does the interview with the school leader and the assistant principal. And then team 2 is really focused on special populations. So their classroom observations will really look at accommodations and you know, if those are being provided based on the students' IEPs. And then also there's interviews that are conducted with special populations coordinators, as well as like the EL teacher and the SPED teacher during the visit. And then team 3 focuses primarily on operations and finance. So they'll get into some classrooms, but the bulk of their focus is going to be around just all the operational things, aspects of the school, and just making sure that all of those things are in place.
One best practice to highlight based on that, thinking about people who are on your teams, oftentimes they are not the regular authorizing staff. They go beyond, you know, not your core staff. They go beyond that and extend out into some of your district team members who don't spend as much time with charter schools, with your charter schools, or even thinking about charter schools. And so I just want to note, as you're thinking about your timeline and prepping for site visits, it's really important and necessary to conduct trainings with your teams. So not only what does it look like when we walk on site and what are we doing and what are we looking for, but also making sure they understand what is within your charter school's autonomy. What's different? You know, what types of feedback do we want to provide them? And so I think those pieces are really important to make sure, particularly with those members who are joining you, who don't spend time with charter schools often, they understand what does it mean to be an authorizer? What is that role? How is that different from our district traditional charter schools? Important to train on that as well.
That is an excellent point, Allie. Thank you so much for sharing that. Prior to our site visits, we had a I think there were 2 trainings that we had with our entire team, and we walked through the site visit protocol, and then we normed the feedback so that, you know, there was alignment and consistency with all of the feedback that we share ultimately in the report with the operators. And it was interesting because all of the members of the of my team on the authorizing accountability team, like they're in the schools more frequently than the folks on the finance team. And so it was very, I think, helpful for them to go through that process and to just be aware of what, what they need to look for and how they need to respond.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other comments in the chat. So if anyone has any final questions for Adrian's team, feel free to reach out to her or to, again, continue to populate in the chat because we still have a few moments. But thank you so much for that presentation and lots of good information, lots of things to think about, especially at the end of the school year. You're going into summer is a great time, as always, to start rethinking or reworking, making adjustments, reflecting on how things went this year and what do we want to adjust for next year. So thanks for that. Okay. Resources and wrapping us up for this session. Waiver guidance, we've been previewing that. Some of you mentioned it as a need. Yes, it is coming. There is a draft that is out there and going through conversations with the department's team, and we're hoping to have it out to you shortly. So I apologize that I don't have it to share today, but we are working on it. So please know that we have not forgotten about that, and hopefully it will be coming soon. Also, again, a link to the commission's website. They have every charter school's agreement listed, all the exhibits, their waiver spreadsheets, all of that stuff is available publicly on their website. If you want to see some exemplars, please jump over there and take a look. And then this, as I mentioned at the beginning, is our last session for this school year. We'll start again in July. And I'll be sending out a survey to get a sense of how things went this year and what you're looking for next school year in terms of topics. If anyone's interested in presenting, do we want to keep the spotlights? How do we feel about some proposed topics? All that good stuff. So that is coming next week. And thank you in advance for completing that for me. And then Michelle has already reached out, but expect to hear some continued conversation with Michelle, who is working for the National Network for District Authorizers. I forget the order of those, but NN4DA, another resource for you all that we'll be building out. That is completely separate from this, but certainly we will bring her in when it makes sense, if it makes sense, so that you're not having lots of different meetings. Happy to involve her and NN4DA in these conversations for next school year as well, if the timing works out for what they're looking to do. But the goal of that is just continuing to build out resources for you all. So thank you again for joining this afternoon. I'm going to stop sharing. If anyone has any questions and wants to stick around for either myself or for regarding the charter agreements, or for Adrian and her team regarding site visits or anything else, feel free to stay on. We'll hang out together. But otherwise, thank you all so much for joining this afternoon. Hope you have a great rest of the afternoon, and we'll be in touch soon. Bye.